I'm happy to start. My name is Atem. I work for STARTS. I lead a project called Communities in Cultural Transition, and that works with uh, refugee communities and also migrant with refugee-like background, in particular those who are recently arrived. These webinars are put together in collaboration with DTP, and we have been working with DTP for the last 2-3 years. It has been a partnership. This series started last year in December, in October last year, and this is the second in this series. The webinar today is on, the title is Genocide Survivors Stories, Resilience, Recovery, and Hope. So if you are here for that, please stay. If you are not here for that, maybe this is the wrong place for you, but I'm hoping that you are here to hear about this topic. I am excited about this topic because you have got really two good speakers. And I am going to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we are zooming in from. I'm zooming in from Bankstown in Sydney, and this is Darug land, and this land has never been ceded, and I acknowledge the connection of the Darug people to land, water, and the environment in Bankstown. And I would like to acknowledge their elders, past, present, and future. I also would like to acknowledge anyone in particular, Joshua Kramer, who is one of our speakers as a traditional custodian himself, and any other traditional custodians among us here. Before I do the intro of our speakers, you are going to be put on mute. If you are not already on mute, please mute yourself. Also note that there will be some information posted on the chat for you. This could be, these are resources that are being put together. And sometimes if some new information is cited while conversations are going on, and they'll be posted on the chat. So keep an eye on what is coming up on the chat. There is also the chat you can post your questions or comments as we go along in the chat. And that way we can have some of your questions there, if not all of them, for later conversation. The way this webinar would work is that we are going to have the speakers speaking first, the two speakers. Each speaker will speak for 10-15 minutes. And then after that, we'll have a Q&A session. So I'm very, very excited about this. Unfortunately, in the world that we live today, genocide is becoming sadly a common word. We hear it all the time in the media. In the past, you probably thought about genocide as something that happened to the Jews long time ago, or happened in the 90s to the people in Rwanda. But today you hear it all the time, and it's unfortunate, but this is the world that we live in. And so I'm very excited today to hear resilience, recovery, hope, and what we can do together to promote that among survivors. The first speaker is going to be, give me a second, is Joshua Kramer. I'll read his short bio here. Joshua Kramer is a descendant of the Wanji, I hope I'm saying this right, correct me, Joshua, and Kalakadon people from Northwest Queensland. Joshua is a barrister who specializes in human rights, class actions, and native title. In 2017, Joshua was the recipient of the National Indigenous Legal Professional of the Year Award and was also appointed to the Board of Legal Aid Queensland. Thank you, Joshua. You're welcome.
Thank you, Atem. And nice to join everybody. And as you say, I'm a traditional custodian from my countries around northwest Queensland, so Wanya country in the Gulf of Carpentaria, and Kalkadoon, which is a country around Mount Isa in northwest Queensland. Tonight I'm joining you from the country of the Yagara language speakers, Mianjin, which is we all know as Brisbane. I'll be quick because I want to get into it because I actually have a lot to say and I could talk for hours on this topic. But what I wanted to do for your listeners was to talk about some of the historical experience across a number of the states and territories in Australia of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And then, as a result of that experience, what are some of the issues we're dealing with today, including the cases I've been working on. Look, I'll start in Queensland, and as I've grown up here, my work has primarily been here, but I've also had the opportunity through my practice as a lawyer to work in other states, and I've spent a lot of time over the last decade working in Western Australia and Northern Territory, and I want to talk to you about the experience of those and some of the cases that we've run as a consequence of the treatment of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Now, Queensland was set up as a colony in around the mid 1860s, 1850s, 1860s. And I'll talk to you about the legislation, the laws that impacted Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. But what we see very early in the colony of Queensland is legislation that starts to remove Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children or Aboriginal children. So from the early days of the colony, one of the first pieces of legislation we see in 1865 was the Industrial and Reformatory Schools Act. So that piece of legislation, those laws gave so it's Industrial and Reformatory Schools Act 1865 Queensland. It gave the government power to remove any child that was deemed neglected under that legislation or under those laws. And if you were Aboriginal, you were automatically considered neglected and you could automatically be removed. And you could be removed from your family for no less than 1 year, so no more than 7. So we see very early on the establishment of the Queensland colony, this effort to remove children. And I want to put that in the context that that was after really that first wave of settlement, which impacted the population here in Queensland. So some of the estimates that in cases that I've worked on, there were potentially around 200,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Queensland just prior to the arrival of the British. We see that population reduced quite significantly, and by the 1890s, the population is sitting around 25,000. So we've seen that population reduced by close to 90%, and we know a lot of that occurred through massacres. We know a lot of that occurred in relation to intentional killing of the Indigenous populations, through poisonings, through shootings, and a whole wave of colonisation to impact that population. As I say, so that legislation, 1865, starts to remove children. In 1897, we then see what we call the first of the protection legislation. The long name of the legislation is the Aboriginal Protection and Restriction of the Sale of Opium Act, 1897. And as I say, the population goes from approximately 200,000 or estimated to be 200,000. By 1897, when that legislation comes in, the population is sitting around 25,000 people. And what we then, Queensland quite systematically then takes control of every Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person and moves them off their traditional country. So I recognise my traditional country at the start, and moves them to settlements, missions and reserves across Queensland. So we see this huge system regime built up by the Queensland government to control and move the Indigenous populations in late 1900s. And the reason for that is because there was, I guess, a number of reasons. Firstly, the population had been reduced so significantly through massacres and murders and other poisonings, other activities. But what happens then is there's this underlying theory that Aboriginal people in particular are part of this doomed race. And that really drives what happens in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And the doomed race theory was effectively this theory of evolution, that Aboriginal people were a doomed race, They were some old ancient race, and they would likely die out in 3 generations. And what the Queensland government did was it established settlements or missions, reserves, all these little prisons within a prisons, effectively, people have described them, but they're generally away from the rest of the Queensland population, so away from cities and towns, often a couple hundred kilometres away from any major centre. Aboriginal people are placed on those. And as I say, the theory was they would die out in 3 generations. And under that regime, because of the British arrival and the impact it had on Aboriginal women in particular and the birthing of children of mixed descent, the government would remove any Aboriginal children that were fathered by non-Indigenous fathers. Again, this doom race theory that because they had non-Indigenous blood, they were likely to be stronger, and they would have to be removed and assimilated into the non-Indigenous population, so the Queensland population. So we see Aboriginal people move to missions under this theory that they would die out. Their children of mixed descent are removed and tried to be and efforts to assimilate them into the non-Indigenous community. Now, on those missions, there's a number of things that happened, and they were set up all across Queensland. And some of those communities, that regime stayed in place until 1986. So from 1897 to 1986. So it's not as old as you might think. But when that legislation or when that era came to an end in 1986, some of those communities still exist today. So we have places what's called Warrabinda, Cherbourg, and Palm Island. They're Aboriginal communities today, and they were set up under this regime. Today, they still have the highest levels of socio and economic disadvantage, a product of this era. But all those communities, all those missions, they were generally run by churches, or there were a couple of government-run ones as well, and they were spread out in different locations across the state, and probably 20, 25 at their peak, maybe 30. Aboriginal people were placed on those missions. People who were able-bodied were required to work. So men, predominantly Aboriginal men, would be sent out to work in the pastoral industry across Queensland. If you owned a pastoral property, you could write to the government and say, I need some workers, and they would send you out 1, 2, 10, whatever Aboriginal workers you would need. Equally, it applied for women. So women would be sent to work in homes across Queensland, the homes of white owners, and they would work as domestic workers. So if you're in Brisbane, for example, you could write to the government and say, I need 2 women to come and be domestic workers, clean, cook for me in my house. And generally people were sent for periods of 12 months. Once that 12 months ended, they'd be sent back to the mission. What actually happened under that regime was people were supposed to be paid money, and the government actually ultimately kept that money. And I'll talk to you about the case I was involved in. But that regime started in 1897. As I say, it affected 3-4 generations right up until 1986, when the last of that mission era came to an end. I'll just speak to you a little bit about the case I was involved in before I talk to the other states. So the case I did a couple of years ago was to try and reclaim some of that money that was, we called it stolen wages, for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here in Queensland who did work for sometimes 10, 20, 30 years and never received any money. The government actually kept their money. And so we ran a case and we settled for about 200, 180, 190 million dollars. It will never be dollar for dollar what people took, but we brought a case to try and bring some compensation back. Just quickly moving on to the other states, Northern Territory and WA, they are a little bit different, and that's why I want to speak to you about those. Queensland had this big system of setting up all these missions. In the Northern Territory, they did not do that as largely as Queensland. They did set up missions, so the Aboriginal population occupied particular areas of country. The pastoralists came in and established stations. In the Northern Territory, they needed a workforce on those stations, so they basically kept the Aboriginal populations that were there. You still do see a lot of people were killed, and I've actually had the privilege of interviewing a man named Teddy Briscoe in in Northern Territory who's the last person alive to witness one of those massacres in the Northern Territory. Now, what happens is, again, there's this focus on removing children of mixed descent in Queensland, in Northern Territory, and we all know assimilating children fits the definition of genocide. But there's a focus on using Aboriginal labour for the pastoral industry, using Aboriginal women to support domestic work, removing Aboriginal children to assimilate them into the non-Indigenous population. And when I say assimilate, they completely break off the relationship that children had. And children who are often removed as babies or 2 or 3 years old have no recollection of who they are or their identity. And we call them the stolen generation. That's sort of where the stolen generation comes across, and it happened across the country. But Northern Territory is a very good example of that. It happened over a similar period of time. I was very fortunate to be involved in a case, we called it the Stolen Generation class action in the Northern Territory. That resolved about 2 or 3 years ago when the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison at the time, apologised and offered about $380 million compensation. Now, I'll talk a little bit about the Kimberleys in Western Australia and then how that's different to the rest of Western Australia. The Kimberleys in the Northern Territory are very similar in that there's a big pastoral industry and they need the labour. And so Aboriginal populations, after that initial wave of settlement where those populations were reduced, where they were killed, massacred, poisoned, etc., they then need a workforce, and that workforce is used to support the pastoral industry. So a lot of the history and the wealth of Australia was really built on the back of Aboriginal workers. There's no debate about that, given the extensive work across the pastoral industry. But what is really interesting about Western Australia and the Northern Territory is in Queensland, there was a complete prohibition on Indigenous culture under that regime for 80, 90 years. And there was a real wholesale impact on language, cultural practices and customs. And yes, they do exist in Queensland to some extent, but the government in Queensland are very active in stamping that out. And so it's had a big impact. For example, my people don't speak their traditional language. If you did, it would have been punished and certainly prohibited at the time. Whereas in the Northern Territory, people still got to practice their culture and their language, and are very similar in Western Australia. What you do see in Northern Territory and WA, which I think is really interesting, is there are still many elders who speak 5 or 6 traditional languages but don't speak English. Many people in those areas lived a completely traditional life up until 1960s, 1970s, some as late as 1980s. They then basically walked out of the desert in Northern Territory or WA and then started living a contemporary life. People who walked out of the desert were generally taken to different pastoral stations and used for cheap labour or free labour for up to a decade or longer. Now, so I guess the experience of Aboriginal people across the country and across and Torres Strait Islanders has been marked by really 2 or 3 significant periods. Firstly, that initial wave of settlement, and for those in Sydney, that might have been as early as the 1700s, early 1800s. In the Kimberleys in Western Australia, that didn't happen until the 1920s, 1930s. So you've got to think of the Indigenous population or non-Indigenous population, that colonisation rolling out across the country over a number of decades, over 100 years, in fact. And so what happened in Sydney in 1788 didn't happen in Western Australia until as late as 1920, 1930. But that initial wave of settlement, no matter what date it was, had a huge impact on the populations. Many people were killed, many people lost, hundreds of thousands, in fact, across Australia. And then the second stage, we see the controlling of the Aboriginal population, Torres Strait Islander population, putting them in missions or using them in pastoral industries or other sectors. During that period, we see the removal of children. And as I say, that really was a period that lasted up until as late as 1986. We then come out of that mission days and we see from the 70s and 80s in particular, a real assertion of their rights and identity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And we've had lots of interesting cases and lots of interesting or lots of really powerful statements about identity and strength and desire and recognition for what's happened to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And over the last few years, we've moved towards, those issues around which many of your listeners will be familiar with. But, recognising the truth of our history here in Australia, recognising that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been uniquely impacted and need to come and resolve, through a treaty or some mechanism, those wrongs that have been inflicted on from government. And, what do we do around recognising Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the Constitution? So I think that's a good 10, 15-minute summary of the experience of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and really looking forward to your questions or Noor's presentation, your questions after it.
Thank you, Joshua, for that presentation. There was a lot in that, and I certainly have learned so much about especially the diversity in the experience of Indigenous people or First Nations people in terms of when they got in contact with white people and what happened. And, so that is something sort of new to me. I didn't have that understanding. Also, the definition of your, genocide by itself, you didn't say much about it, but you did mention, removal of children, that denies them the language, the culture, and then being used, as almost slaves. You didn't say that.
Yeah.
But,
I will just say on that. So the Convention Against Genocide recognises the forcible transferring of children from one group to another, and certainly the way that the stolen generation have been treated. The issue in Australia, though, is we didn't ratify that until 2002. So we didn't ratify the Genocide Convention. I don't know whether you discussed that on your first session, but Australia didn't ratify that convention until 2002. So all those historical experiences of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people until 1986 weren't protected by those international instruments.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for that. We'll move on because I'm sure there'll be plenty of discussion after this, and we want to make sure there's time for that. The next speaker tonight, which I'm also looking forward to, is Noor Azizah. Noor Azizah is a Rohingya refugee. Is a passionate advocate for refugee women's rights and human dignity. She is the co-founder and director of Rohingya, I'm hoping I'm saying this right, Myanmar, correct me, Noor, collaborative network focused on human rights and education. Named a recipient of the New South Wales Young Women of the Year Award, Noor continues to inspire through her powerful advocacy. And I'm really looking forward to your presentation, Noor. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that really kind introduction. I'm just going to share my screen and speak to the pictures that will go with it. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and recognise that their continuing connection to land, waters and community. I pay my respects to them, their cultures and to elders both past and present. And in particular, I pay my respects to Joshua as a First Nations that is on our webinar today. I'm going to be speaking about the Rohingya genocide, the ongoing genocide that remains active till today. So I just want to start by providing a trigger warning. There might be some content that might be quite distressing. So if you feel like you need to take time off, please do that. So who are the Rohingya people? The Rohingya people are from this country over here called Burma, Myanmar, right in between Thailand, India, Bangladesh, and China. We come from the state of Arakan. It's also known as Rakhine. So in our language, it's Arakan. In the Bama language, it's Rakhine. So I'm going to refer to it as Arakan. We were actually a kingdom pre-state, when states even existed. We were known as the Kingdom of Rahma, and we were a striving kingdom. And then eventually we became Burma, Myanmar, integrated into the country. And then there was a period of time when the English invaded our state, and then we became Burma, Myanmar again. There was a short period of time when the Japanese did also invade the state of Arakan. In our country, there are more than 135 ethnic indigenous groups. Today, Rohingya are not recognized as an indigenous ethnic group in our country, and that's part of the genocidal process to remove Rohingya from our ancestral homeland. All the images I'm using today are real images of Rohingya. At the bottom over here is a photo of a Rohingya student group from the university when we did have access to education. And these images at the bottom over here are pictures that were painted by Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh. A little bit about me. I was born in Arakan state, as you can see in the red in the corner, just near the border of Bangladesh in Mangdo. And in the 90s, there were waves of violence against the Rohingya, with the military junta, who is the main perpetrator of the Rohingya genocide, came to our villages, burnt our homes. They were shooting families, they were raping women, and my parents decided to flee. My mother carried 5 of her children across Southeast Asia. We took every mode of transportation possible. We walked through Southeast Asia. We took every bus possible. We took every boat possible. We were homeless for a lot of the time. We relied on the generosity of host communities. We didn't know where we were going to end up, but it was actually much safer being on the run than being in our own ancestral homeland. And we ended up in Malaysia, in Sabah. So Sabah is a very small rural town. For you guys, if you've been to Malaysia, you've probably been to Kuala Lumpur, which is the capital city. But Sabah is completely different. We were the only Rohingya family there, and I lived as a refugee in Malaysia, displaced for the first 8 years and a half of my life. And the conditions in Malaysia remains extremely dire. I spent 90% hiding in the jungles of Borneo as a child, hiding from the police, afraid of being detained. And the situation remains the same today, as Malaysia is not part of the 1951 Refugee Convention. More than 200,000 Rohingya refugees are living in Malaysia looking for a better life. So the beginning of the Rohingya genocide started in 1942. What this looked like was compulsory labor. So Rohingya are forced to work for free under extreme conditions. Our citizenship was stripped away in 1982. So we remain the largest stateless community in the world today. There are about 3 million Rohingya worldwide, more than 90% outside of our ancestral homeland, and only 1% of the 3 million today live with dignity, live with identity, and 99% live in refugee camps and are in hiding. So our part of the genocidal violence was to remove us from our citizenship. Rape is used as a military tactic, confiscation of land. So there were times and cases where the military junta would go to Rohingya households in the villages and tell Rohingya families to go and live in the IDP camps and give our homes to Bama and Rakhine Buddhist families. Confiscation of land. So we've owned land for a very long time, being that it belongs to us. It's been times where our land has completely been removed by the military junta. Physical violence, restrictions on marriage. A Rohingya cannot marry outside of their ethnic group without the permission from the military junta. A Rohingya cannot marry a Rakhine or a Bama without permission. Closure of our mosques. Now, this was deliberate. It wasn't because they didn't want us to practice our religion. It was because when natural disasters did occur, Rohingya are going to look for a stable building to seek shelter. And our mosques are quite stable. So we've had instances where we've had cyclones and Rohingya have nowhere to seek shelter because our mosques are completely chained up. Denied access to education. My own mother is illiterate because she didn't have any access to education in Arakan, Rakhine. Regulation of families. So this picture at the bottom over here, yeah, these are all real pictures, by the way, is a picture where the military has gone to a Rohingya household and are counting how many there are. They're not even given names, they're given numbers. And if you're not accounted for in your books and you're found at the shops or playing soccer with your son and you're not in their books while they're in there, you could be killed or detained. Burning of villages and homes. These were our passports when we were, our citizenship when we were citizens of Burma, Myanmar. So why has this genocide been so successful? The biggest tool the military junta has used is use hate speech against us. They spread hate speech in Burma, Myanmar to other ethnic groups to showcase that Rohingya are not from Rakhine, Arakan, Rohingya from Bangladesh or Rohingya are immigrants and so on. So this hate speech was on newspapers, was on radios, and these are all real hate speech, calling us cockroaches, animals, thorns, saying that we're too black and we're too dark. And this hate speech was very successful. It manifested to actual violence against Rohingya. This is a student group at the bottom saying that no Rohingya belong in our land and that we should go back home in Bangladesh. And therefore, in Burma, Myanmar, they received quite a large domestic support. Hence why when violence does occur against Rohingya, it's been normalized because we've been dehumanized completely to not be seen as human. This is the current illegal prime minister of the country, Minola. During the 2017 genocidal campaign, he said that there was a Bengali problem and he needed to finish it. So there was an intent to destroy. This was used during the ICJ case in 2019 by the Gambia of before and after photo on Google Earth of the bulldozing of Rohingya villages. So what's the benefit of killing an entire population, the annihilation of an entire people? There is economic incentive to this. Our land, we have a lot to provide. We have resources, we have oil and gas, we have poultry, we have farms and so on. During the 2017 genocide, that killed more than 24,000 Rohingya and displaced more than 700,000 Rohingya, they built the Chokpu port. This was built by China along with Burma, Myanmar, and this exists till today. So it's a deep port pipeline that allows for oil and gas to go all across to China. And this was finished in 2018. This is the port. Now, this is another trigger warning. This image here was used during the 2019 International Court of Justice case that is still ongoing of the massacres that occurred in 2017. The military junta lined all our men up. They grabbed our men from our houses in our villages in the IDP camps. They lined our men. They also grabbed our women and the children and put them at the back of the shack. So where you see the men are, there would be a shack right next to them. So what they did was they raped our women while killing their husbands and their children. But they kept our women alive on purpose because they know that our women are going to run as far away as possible from this hellhole. They're obviously going to go to Bangladesh and carry their 7 children and never come back. This was the psychological torture that the military junta did. So this was the aftermath. Feel free to turn off your screen if it's too much. And this was presented during the ICJ case. So again, genocidal violence, part of it is sexual and gender-based violence. Women are being weaponized. After 2017, there was a fact-finding mission by the UN and they found more than 25,000 women were impregnated by genocidal rape. And this genocidal, this sexual violence doesn't actually end when women flee Burma, Myanmar. It continues in Southeast Asia. And I can talk a bit more about that a little bit later. So in 2020, the ICJ ruled and ordered Myanmar to prevent further genocide. Did they listen? No, they didn't. They continued with their ongoing genocide and killed hundreds and thousands of people. So what is the impact of the genocide? Rohingya fleeing, looking for shelter, looking for a safe haven. More than 1 million Rohingya refugees reside in Bangladesh, the largest refugee camp in the world. I got to visit 2 years ago and the situation was extremely dire. Rohingya are currently stuck inside Arakan as well. The fighting against the Arakan army and the military junta. And there's been mass reports in the last few months. The Arakan army is also conducting genocide. So Arakan army is an army that's led by the Rakhine people. They're also, the last genocidal violence was by them. So Rohingya are fleeing to neighboring countries, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, India. Just like my family, we fled to Malaysia. This is just a snippet of where Rohingya are, the 3 million people. These are the recent statistics. So more than 45,000 Rohingya have been displaced since last year. We've seen beheadings, killings, village burning, and my organization, we had to step up and provide care to more than 3,000 families. Now, this is about healing and process. I'll quickly go over this before you probably have many questions for Joshua and I. Surviving the Rohingya genocide. These are just pictures of resettlement. This was the first time I was able to celebrate my birthday. It was in 2004. I was turning 9, and it was the first time I had a cake and I had my friends near me. This is a picture of my mum in her 20s when she was in Arakan, Rakhine. This picture over here is my passport, my first ever passport photo. So I was born a stateless person, and it was the first time I was given an Australian passport, and it was the first time I actually felt like a human being, and I felt like I was recognized. But what does my journey of healing and resilience look like? I've been working for my community for about 10 years now. Obviously, when we resettled in Australia, we had that freedom that many of my people don't have today, but we didn't feel that complete freedom because our freedom is only complete when all Rohingya are free. About 2 years ago, I started this organization called Rohingya Maya Final Collaborative Network. Maya Final just means women in our language. We are a refugee-led, Rohingya-led, women-led organization comprising of 8 Rohingya genocide survivors from the US that have resettled in the US, New Zealand, Canada, Australia, and we work for our community focusing on women and children. And I'm running out of time, so quickly go over these photos. Some of the work that we've been able to do, and this is what healing looks like for me. It's giving back to my community and making sure that the Rohingya crisis is not forgotten. That's often the case, and that's often the label that even in high-level meetings at the UN, the label is always the forgotten crisis. And a dialogue with other ethnic groups, visiting our women in Malaysia, in Thailand, hosting cultural nights to combat the misinformation, disinformation that's spreading in Southeast Asia. In Australia, we hold cultural nights as well with our community that have resettled. And we often go to Switzerland to look for systemic change and attend high-level meetings. If you're a fan of Kate Blanchett, I did a talk with her about a year ago on statelessness. The special repertoire, meeting the Rohingya community and focusing on women and children in Sydney. And a lot of them fled the 2017 genocidal violence. Canada, so Canada is the first state to have a genocide determination and recognized the Rohingya crisis as a genocide. So again, we were the first responders providing aid to more than 3,000 families in the last year, working on missing and disappeared persons project. More than 650 Rohingya have gone missing in the last year. There's been an 80% increase of Rohingya arrival in Indonesia and Malaysia. Supplying resources in Malaysia. So part of the work we do is collecting hate speech data. So this hate speech is paid by very high up people. We saw it when Prabowo won his election in Indonesia. And these are some screenshots that we've been able to retrieve. You can spend 30 seconds reading them. So we can see there's colorism and racism that comes with it. So this lovely lady actually tagged my profile, saying that I gave birth to too many kids. I have 0 kids. Providing opportunities for our women in the camps in Indonesia. There are 7 camps today. Providing gender-sensitive care to 6 Rohingya women that were raped on the boat. They've given birth 2 months ago, and we continue to give them support. Okay, I'm just going to stop there because I know I've taken too much time now. So I might pass it on to you, Atem or Claire.
Thank you very much, Noor. Excellent presentation. I was struck by this comment that you find safety in actually running away. It's safer to run away than to stay, and that is true of conflicts. And when violence is happening, you are more likely to feel more safe than when you're running. But also, your healing process where you're giving back to the community and making sure what has happened hasn't been forgotten, and the advocacy that you do to support your community and raise the voice of the community to ensure that the community actually is still alive and its issue is not, swept under the carpet. Look, we have 15 minutes to do Q&A, and I'm not sure whether there are any questions on the chat, but people can put in the question on the chat, or you can raise your hand. As people do that, I will just do the first one, a very quick one. And this question is going to go to Kramer, Josh Kramer. And I'm wondering, Josh, in terms of healing, recovery, and you personally being a First Nations person, how does that look to you, and what role could people like us who do not understand this experience, what could we do to help?
Yeah, thank you. An important question, Atem, and it's well recognised that Aboriginal people have suffered significant direct trauma, but also intergenerational trauma. So the culmination of so many violent acts or acts against them by governments over many generations has had a really significant emotional and traumatic impact on the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population. The country, Australia as a country, was starting to move towards recognising the impact of that period. For those who've been in Australia for some time, we had Kevin Rudd, who was the Prime Minister at the time, recognising or apologising for the impact for the stolen generation and what had happened. And as I say, Prime Minister Scott Morrison compensating that group. And that is actually really important because there are sections of the community, the Australian community, that continue to deny the experiences of Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people. They continue to deny the history and the impact on them. And as I say, we as a nation were starting to recognise that. And my role up until recently was I was chairing in Queensland what we call the Truth Telling and Healing Inquiry. So the previous Queensland government had set up an inquiry over 3 years to look at that history, to make recommendations for how to address healing across that population. But unfortunately, we had an election in October, and the new government brought an end to that inquiry only 6 months in. Victoria have had their truth telling inquiry, which is almost complete now over 3 years, but the other states haven't moved there. So I guess it's important. There's a lot of and there's a lot of discrimination, and a lot of racism that is directed towards Aboriginal people in the country, and there's a lot of denial of their experiences. So taking the time through things like tonight to start to learn about those experiences, to learn that we often, we share experiences as Indigenous people from different parts of the world. Our experiences are often very similar, and there are those similarities of persecution. And we can support each other, develop empathy for our own experience, but also advocate and educate others about the history and what's occurred in our country and the impact it's had on this population.
Thank you for that answer. I'm not sure, Claire, please help out with the chat if there are any questions that I might miss or anything.
Yeah, we've just got the first question. There's one for Joshua. The person said that he didn't know the removal of children is part of genocide. What other key features have happened to Aboriginal people that are distinctly genocidal?
First, there was the wiping out of the population. And as I've said, in Queensland, that was approximately almost 200,000 people. So 90% of the population was taken. Similar to Noor, land was taken, and they dispossessed of the land. They were moved into places where they were prohibited from practicing their culture, their language, and customs. Every aspect of their lives was controlled by government. What they ate, what they wore, where they worked, what they were paid, who they married, their religion was all controlled by the government in that period. And then, as I say as well, genocide's really trying to wipe out a particular population, and that was done really significantly here, as well as removing children of mixed descent. As I say, the whole theory was that Indigenous population would die out, and the Australian governments or state governments wanted to create an environment to allow that to occur over the next 2 or 3 generations, or 2 or 3 generations from that early colonisation period.
Yeah, thank you for that. I can see there are a couple of questions here about
I think Piteri has her hand raised, Atum.
yeah, go for it.
Just another question for you, Joshua. Thank you for your presentation. And Noor, thank you. I just wanted to ask, in terms of current ongoing genocide, I've heard Aboriginal leaders talk about how the strategies have changed. So like slavery has now changed shape into incarceration, or forced removal of children, stolen generations has turned into the foster care system. So could you comment about what ongoing current genocide looks like in so-called Australia?
Yeah, I'll just say, so I was involved in those cases that looked at what happened historically across the state, Queensland, Northern Territory, WA, and that amounted about $1 billion in compensation. But the work I'm doing now, there's some restrictions on what you can talk about as a barrister, but I am involved in class actions, big cases representing Aboriginal children and their families who are removed by governments from 1982 right up into today. So what has happened in this contemporary space. We've got cases running in Queensland. That's been in the federal court for about 2 years. We've got cases running in Western Australia and New South Wales, and that's been in the federal court since November last year. So that is looking at contemporary removals, and that's hundreds of thousands of Aboriginal children and including families, hundreds of thousands of people affected by those contemporary removals. And the basis of those cases are that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are discriminated against by the removals, and as a result, removed at drastically high rates in non-Indigenous children.
Thank you. There's a question here about whether Rohingya people took up arms, and how did member state of the UN respond to Rohingya refugees? That's for you, Noor, sorry.
Yeah, so we did take up arms, and then we laid our arms. Our arms were actually supported by the Gaddafi government around the 70s and the 80s. And then we currently don't have any armed groups that we claim. There are a couple of armed groups that are working with the military junta and causing more harm to the community than anything else. And I can see there's a couple of questions.
Yes.
Do you want me to just go over it?
Yeah.
Sure. Saudi Arabia, there are a large amount of Rohingya refugees. My own family are over there, and they don't have any access. So the situation is extremely dire in Saudi Arabia as well. And how did they get there? There is a Rohingya family in South Sudan in the refugee camp. So Rohingya make very long journeys just to look for a safe place. So in terms of Saudi Arabia, that some of them could have walked and then took a flight, and then the journey of each refugee is so varied. So I won't speak to it, but in terms of Rohingya, we often are found in many parts of the world because we're just looking for a safe place to live in. Allies from Nathan, what is important actions that allies can do? What would you like to see from communities from here? I mean, if you put the Rohingya genocide on a street map of Australia, the Rohingya genocide is only happening 3 streets away from our country over here. It's about an 8-hour flight from Gadigal in Sydney, Australia. So I think there's so much more we can do here as the neighbours. This crisis, this genocide is happening in the backyard of Australia. So the biggest thing we need right now is not the fancy genocide determinations, because that already exists and it's clearly not working because violence are still continuing. We need public support more than anything. I mean, the biggest example I can give you is the Palestinian courts has received such a vast amount of public support. Therefore, the ICJ case was quite quick. The ceasefire was quick. And that's something that that support we haven't seen within our community. In 2017, my own mum called me and said, we need to go to Canberra and protest. We went, and you know who was there? Genocide survivors, not other communities, not other Islamic communities, just Rohingya genocide survivors. So more than anything, we need the support of the public.
And I just said someone's hand was up, Carly.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for Noor and Joshua's explanation, and my sympathies goes to you. And probably, Timor-Leste, with our historical background of internal conflict, due to the different political affiliations, and also related to annexations, consequences of the class ideologies and so on and so forth. So in our case, Timor-Leste leaders, established a CTF, what we call a Commission to Friendship with Indonesia, in 2005. And aside from the development of the commissions as a retroactive justice mechanism that what our leaders from both countries has agreed that the demand of the people about justice needed. And related to this background, my question is, what are the factors of have contributed to the most of the success of transitional justice, either for people in Rohingya or also in Australia and Aborigine? Thank you.
You want to go, Joshua?
Yeah, look, I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and that I talked a little bit about the cases that I've been involved in, and the reason I've been involved in those cases because those issues haven't been resolved properly. We've had to bring cases. There has been in the early 70s some the assertion or Aboriginal people wanting to have land back through land rights and things, but look, a lot of these issues remain unresolved, and as that question earlier, a lot of these issues have morphed into, other things like child removals today and incarceration, and so, the impacts of history still lingers and really is unresolved in Australia, and that's why we're trying to work to, things like the Voice, Treaty, Truth, and constitutional change. That's what we're trying to achieve.
Do you have any response to that? So, by the way, this will be the last question. So, Noor, if you have response to that, please go.
Sure. In terms of transitional justice for Rohingya, my organization, we've already started a truth-telling process. There is conflict happening inside the entire country now, post-2021 military coup. And we thought, people often think post-conflict, but we need to start now. So what we've done is we've met with women of Burma that are currently in exile, Kachin women, Pai women. These are women from different Indigenous ethnic groups from Burma, Myanmar. And we've had dialogues with them about what happened to us as a Rohingya. And it was quite emotional. We spent a good 2 days with them. And they, despite racist people from Burma, Myanmar, saying that Rohingya don't belong, they've actually fought for us, and they've said we've lost friends and family because we've stood up for Rohingya, and we've built that connection. So when we do go back to ancestral homeland one day, hopefully in my lifetime, that process has already started, because you cannot put an entire people that have been exiled and persecuted for 83 years back without a truth-telling and reckoning process. So we've already started that process, and we started with women. I don't know if I can picture a group of angry men in a room talking about violence and persecution.
Okay, thank you, Noor, and thank you, everybody. We'll have to leave it here. It's 7 o'clock. We could have this conversation on and on. I am hoping that all the questions that are put on the chat could be answered at some point, because we have your contact details. I would like to request that Noor and Joshua, if you have the time at some point, just respond to those questions, and I'm sure we'll have an arrangement to make that happen. But I would like to thank you all. And before we close, I will pass it to Claire to do the votes of thanks. Thank you.
Thanks, Satem.
Thank you so much.
On behalf of the Diplomacy Training Program, I'd like to thank Noor and Joshua for their time tonight, and for being willing to share their experiences with all of us. We definitely valued your time and being able to hear about the experiences of both the Rohingya women and the Indigenous Australians. I'd also like to thank everybody for participating and showing up to the webinar. This, as Atem said, this is part of a webinar series that DTP is doing with STARTS. It's the second of our Genocide Convention webinars. The final one will be next week, so I'm putting in a little plug for that. So that will be next Thursday at 6 p.m. I'll put a link in the chat to register for that if you haven't already. And our speakers for that one are Lana Tator, who is a Palestinian academic, Debbie Stoddard, who works with Myanmar issues, as well as Jonathan from ANU, who also is an academic on Myanmar. So we hope that people will be able to join us next week for that, and as that will conclude our Genocide Convention. We then will move on to a series of webinars on the UN mechanisms, and we'll let you know all about them over the coming weeks. So thank you once again, and thank you, Atem, for facilitating and moderating the session, and I hope everyone has a good evening. I'll send the recording, the links, as well as Noor's PowerPoint presentation, hopefully tomorrow, but it might be on Friday, but you'll definitely get all of that by the end of the week. So thank you very much and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.